Well, thanks everyone for joining us here today. I'm Ben Harris with the Monterey-based Salmon and Trout Project, and this is the 6th and final of the Step to the Sea virtual field tours. This is Fish Finatics, and we're kind of looking at how salmon and humans interact and how we may have some impacts in the past and maybe some conservation measures here in the future. And what we're going to do is have just a couple of slides to talk through a slideshow, some of the habitat impacts, and then we'll do the walking tour of the hatchery and then finish up with some things you can do at home to help conserve salmon and steelhead, as well as careers in natural resources, fish and wildlife biology. Like I said, today on the Fish Fanatics lesson, we're going to be talking about kind of the interaction between salmon and humans. Can anyone, it's an open question, anyone tell me one of the largest impacts that humans have had on salmon and salmon habitats in the past 100 years?
I mean, aside from what you have a picture of sitting there?
No, I kind of tried to drop the big obvious hint there, but that is what I'm talking about, Zoe. So yeah, dams.
Construction. Blocking their route.
Yeah, exactly. Blocking the route, barrier to migration. And it's important we know that that's not just a barrier for adults returning home, but also for juveniles coming downstream. We will talk a little bit more about dams and different kinds of barriers. And I did want to just drop the hint there on the first slide that one of the biggest impacts we've had is damming of riverways, but really habitat as a whole is the major influencing factor in the decline of salmon populations over the past 100 years. So we'll go ahead and dive into that and kind of unpack the topic of human impacts to salmon habitats, and then some of the things that are being done to conserve salmon. So yeah, like Zoe was saying, one of the biggest impacts to salmon that humans have ever had is in-stream habitat change, and particularly dams and barriers that have been constructed in major river systems. So there's a study that was published about 10 years ago that demonstrated about 75%, 3/4 of the salmon habitat in the state of California, the spawning and rearing habitat, has been lost. And that's not just due to dams and barriers, that's also because water's too warm, the substrate's not right, but really gets back to that central aspect of habitat being the limiting factor in salmon populations, at least in California. So there's a picture on the left there of one of those big intimidating dams you see right there, and that's definitely a huge issue. It's because fish come up to that thing and clearly not going to jump right over that, but there's been some human ingenuity into building fish ladders and bypasses, ways for salmon to get past dams. But it's not quite a natural system, and it still is an obstacle. Even when you build the fish passage aspects into a dam, it still poses an obstacle to fish moving up or downstream. The thing I want to draw attention to is that when we talk about a barrier, it doesn't have to be a giant concrete wall like you're seeing in that picture on the left there. Something like you see in the picture on the right might look kind of unassuming or not very threatening to a salmon swimming upstream. But culverts like that are really an impediment to fish moving upstream and being able to access headwater tributaries and spawn. So a lot of the habitat is blocked off on the main stems of rivers with these large dams that you see there, but there's also something a little more pervasive and probably blocking off a lot more of the headwater habitats of these smaller culverts that you see on the right. And it might seem like if a salmon has swum through the ocean and up the river that a culvert should be no problem for it. But the real problem with the culvert is that it's got no place for the salmon to rest. It's basically a straight chute or like a fire hose of water just coming out of that culvert. So trying to get up that is a lot more difficult than even a really strong flowing river because there's no pocket water, nowhere for the salmon to kind of park and rest for a little bit as they're moving upstream. So when we're talking about barriers and fish passage, I just want to make sure everyone knows that we're not just talking about giant concrete dams like you see on the left here. What you see on the right there is as much of a barrier to salmon movement as that. The fish can't get up above it, it's a barrier. Something else to draw attention to is when you're looking at barriers in the system that are natural, things like waterfalls or a bunch of trees piled up in the river, that might seem like a barrier. Really, that's more of a natural obstacle. Salmon can overcome that sort of thing. They can find little pocket waters in the deadfalls or behind boulders in a waterfall system, and they can still move upstream. They've evolved and adapted to survive with things like that in their rivers over hundreds of thousands of years. They have not evolved to deal with things like dams and culverts. kind of moving into the second aspect of human impacts, anyone want to, I mean, I'm dropping big hints here again, but anyone want to mention another huge human impact that has been put on salmon habitats the past 100 years?
Water consumption.
Exactly, Matt. So water use for whatever purpose is going to decrease the amount of salmon habitat available. It just makes sense that the more water that's in the river, the more habitat there is for fish. The less water there is, you kind of start to dry down the smaller creeks first and then the larger rivers last, but you're still losing habitat at a pretty large scale when you take water out at large quantities. That thing on the left there does, I mean, it's a river. That's the San Joaquin River in the Central Valley of California. That is still a river, and it looks like a river. If you thought of it, it might appear that way, but something I want to draw attention to is just how uniform that habitat looks. If you're thinking of a river and it's just this water flowing through an easy channelized strait, it's missing some of the important stuff that makes a river system able to have salmon in it. And it's not just the making rivers more normalized and channelized like you see on the left there. There's also development that happens in the estuary. Now, from the other step lessons that Richard's gone through, you know how important estuary habitats are to particularly steelhead, but also salmon. When they're migrating out to sea, they need to be able to get to the estuary and have this nutrient-rich, high productivity place where they can feed and get strong before moving out to the ocean. So what else lives in estuaries other than salmon? What I'm trying to call attention to here is humans. Most of our large cities are at the mouth of rivers on the ocean or on the estuary. So your places where you have all these important estuary habitats are most often developed by mankind. That's another impact that humans have had on the habitat of salmon. I think when you look at these systems, like the pictures here, particularly the one on the left, you see what a channelized, really human-altered river can look like. And if you want to take a look at a more natural system, it's going to be something like that. It's going to be a lot more, a word I'm going to keep coming back to when I talk about salmon habitats is complexity. When you have something that looks like this picture on the left, what you've lost is some of the channels coming off of the side. Notice this is just one straight main stem. You've lost the riparian vegetation, the things that overhang the river on the banks. And that's, as you know from Richard's past lessons, riparian vegetation is really important to put benthic macroinvertebrates back in the stream and to provide shade cover, keep the temperature of the water low. Really, to make a healthy salmon habitat, you need that riparian vegetation, and you need, again, that complexity that you see here. Some of the stuff you see in this picture, and I think that this is southeastern Alaska, but a place where a salmon habitat is pretty well intact, is these side channels coming off of the main stem and rejoining lower down. It's actually called an anabranching side floodplain channel. You see some natural scour on the other side of the bank. But most importantly, there's vegetation. You see some existing trees along the main stem of the river corridor. You also see these mid-channel bars, these places where salmon can park up behind when the flow is high and find a place to rest. So again, I'm not going to flip between these two the whole time, but I do want you to just look at the difference between that picture on the left, how very channelized, very developed, and very not natural that looks, and just how complex and wild and natural that looks. That's a big part of what is the impact that humans have had on salmon, is reducing the complexity of river habitats and estuaries in particular. So before I go to the next slide, anyone want to offer up some other pretty habitat-centric impacts that humans have had on salmon? Anybody got any ideas?
And one that I always find fascinating that is not within the last 100 years, but more like within the last 250 years. The Hudson Bay Company made a massive market in pelts from Canada and the Northwest, all across Canada, really. And they trapped out so many beavers that the beaver pond habitat was radically reduced. And that was a single thing that the humans did right in the beginning of European invasion of North America that really changed salmon habitat. The quantity of water that was held back, slowed down by those beaver dams made a massive difference. Just a curiosity.
Yeah, it's a great thing to bring up. That's a real good example of how we don't really understand ecosystems complexity until we start taking the pieces out. take the beavers out of that system, they're kind of the original hydrologic engineers. Beavers are the ones that are taking trees down and building structures in the stream. And they don't cost millions of dollars to do it. You just have to keep the beavers around. It's definitely true. Yeah, beavers are a major aspect of, in particular, river habitats that taking them out did a lot of damage to the complexity. Carrying on. So the one I was looking for, Matt is right, the beavers are a big one, but I was kind of looking for a more pervasive, wide scale thing. Climate change is a global problem. And I'll get to it later, some of the actions you can take locally to address something like climate change. It might seem a little too big to get a handle on, but that's not really true. The thing I want to look at here is the picture on the left shows the change in surface temperature of the ocean from 1901 to 2015. And you can tell from that graph and the color bar there at the bottom that not a lot has changed for the cooler. There's a little bit there in Greenland because of the glaciers melting, but virtually every ocean surface temperature reading on the planet has increased. Everything is getting warmer. And what we're kind of fighting against here in the central coast of California is the species that are cold water adapted, like salmon and steelhead. They are dependent on having cool ocean water. And not only in the ocean, also river habitats. But as those water temperatures, both inland and in the marine environment, start to increase, you're going to see them kind of retreat northwards to places that still have that temperature range that they can live in. So places like, again, Central California and Central California coho, they're really kind of on the southern edge of their range. And we're trying to keep them from retreating further north. And that's kind of the first step in protecting biodiversity. The last thing, climate change is a major topic, and I'm not doing it fair justice here, but we'll get to some of the things that people can do at home to address that later on in the talk. The last thing I have as far as human impacts go is overfishing. And there is a reason I put it last. It's because overwhelmingly, fishery scientists will tell you that the biggest impact and the biggest reason for salmon's decline in the past 200 years is the loss of habitat. Overfishing can happen, it does happen, and it has happened. But the way things have such a pronounced decline has happened for salmon is really due to the loss of inland river and spawning habitats. And something to remember about, particularly the United States and Canada, is they very closely manage their salmon fisheries. They're pretty much under the jurisdiction of several councils, federal and state agencies. People pay really close attention to it. So overfishing is much less of an impact to salmon in the Pacific than it used to be, and it's much less of an impact than habitat loss is. Kind of positive changes that we've seen more recently with the conservation movement and things people are doing to try to protect these habitats. Thrown around a lot, but habitat restoration includes all of these actions that people are taking to try to restore places that have lost that complexity, that are no longer really hospitable to salmon and steelhead, and that's going on across the country. Here in California, one of the things that's a big press item is the removal of dams. And it's kind of a good news story that all of the Klamath dams on the Klamath River are going to start coming down here this year, which is actually the largest dam removal project in the history of the world. It's going to open up hundreds of miles of river and stream habitat to spawning salmon. Really landmark movement and landmark achievement in the dam removal movement. So other things, you see a picture there of them blowing up dams. Doesn't always have to be big pronounced explosion. Sometimes they just notch the top of it and let the water do the work and kind of bring down the rest of the dam more or less naturally. Other things that people do to kind of restore stream habitats is go around and put in large woody debris or these logs like you see in the picture on the right there. Build these structures that are trying to recreate some of that habitat that was lost with the channelization of streams and rivers. So those large woody debris structures will trap sediment and create something called a plunge pool behind it, where there's a lot deeper water. The water stays cooler around those log jams, and that kind of restores salmon habitat in a way that just going in and digging stuff out wouldn't. Those log jams are actually meant to kind of break apart and fall and become part of the natural system, and that's trying to overcome the loss of those large woody debris that comes out when people log the wood in lumber operations. Some other work can go on in the riparian zone, replanting of native vegetation, or trying to deal with road construction, sediment, things like fine silt and sand pouring into the watershed. All of those are actions that are taken as far as direct physical habitat restoration. Less of a physical aspect is a policy one. People have been water conservationists in California for a good while now, or many people have, I shouldn't say all people, but that's really trying to protect the habitat as well. It's a policy-minded way to keep water in the river. Like we were saying, the more water that is in the stream, the more habitat there is for salmon and steelhead. And not only can conserving water help, just the way it is managed and cooperating with water users can go a long way. People like agriculture companies, dam operators, just by working together and finding ways to divert water that are not quite as impactful as early summer withdrawals and pulse flows, things that they can do that are not really taking any water away from humans or salmon, it's just timing things correct. So cooperation on water policy can come a long way. Now, those are kind of the physical habitat restoration and water policy actions that people take. There is another action that's kind of the central point of today's lesson, which is conservation hatcheries, how they all fit into the conservation of salmon and steelhead. So conservation hatcheries, and what you'll see in the video talk here in just a second, they are designed to help prevent the extinction of critically endangered fish species. They are very different from the hatcheries you see built around those dams that are usually called mitigation hatcheries, because they are the goals of these conservation hatcheries are not to make up for lost habitat, they are to recover the species from extinction. So usually you see a lot lower numbers of fish raised, you see different practices engaged at the hatchery. The way that these hatcheries are operated usually involves careful genetic management or monitoring, and there is Instream monitoring as well. There's things like electroshocking and running a Weir. You're actually going to see that in the video as well. Things that people do in the watershed to actually count fish and assess the success of a program. It's really cutting edge fishery science is going into how conservation hatcheries operated. And that's been a helpful way to save many salmoniid populations. There's Lahontan cutthroat trout on the Eastern Sierra and Western Nevada and Pyramid Lake drainages. They've actually brought Lahontan cutthroat trout, working together with the Paiute tribe and the Nevada and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They've actually been able to bring Lahontan cutthroat trout back from the brink of extinction. There's a picture of one down there on the bottom right. They're just beautiful fish. And on the bottom left here is another example, the one that you're going to be seeing. The other one I'm going to talk about here in the hatchery video is Central California Coast coho. And that's really the species that's raised at Kingfisher Flat Hatchery, the one operated by Monterey Bay Salmon and Trout Project. But both of these projects, as well as the Snake River sockeye, have been able to bring fish back from the numbers where you're counting them, in functional zeros, where fish are coming back and there aren't enough of them to sustain a population. And we're starting to see a few come back naturally, which is really helping to prevent the extinction of those species. You're starting to preserve the local genetics, and fish coming back naturally is what these programs are all about. Again, looking at the goals of these conservation hatcheries, it's fundamentally different than a mitigation hatchery where you're basically just putting out as many fish as possible to make up for lost habitat. And careers and natural resources. Does anyone want to talk about the hatchery video or any of the stuff we do at Kingfisher Flat and answer any questions you guys might have? Hey everyone, welcome to Kingfisher Flat Hatchery here on Big Creek, about a half hour north of Santa Cruz. And this hatchery is actually part of something really exciting, trying to prevent the extinction of a locally adapted species of salmon, the Central California Coast coho salmon. And the work we do here is a little bit different from some of the larger hatcheries, the larger production facilities. The fish we're raising here aren't necessarily to catch, they're to support the wild populations and to try and bring this species back and recover them. So what you're going to see today is actually our fry room where we incubate eggs until they become fry or little baby salmon. And you're also going to see some of the outdoor rearing vessels where we have the fish that are a little bit bigger than that. And you're actually going to get to see us release some of these coho salmon to the wild today to try and, again, support local populations and prevent the extinction of Central Coast coho. So here is Kingfisher Flat, and we'll walk you guys through every piece of the facility and get you to see a release. So what we have here is the moist air incubator. And this is the first place that eggs go once they're spawned out of a female fish. So they're mixed, the eggs and milk are mixed, loaded into the moist air incubator, and then they're sprayed with a fine mist of water that keeps the eggs all nice and cool and wet, just what they want to be. So these little nozzles here coming down the front are actually just like the vegetable misters you see in the supermarket. What they're doing is keeping a pretty constant moisture level on top of these eggs so they stay nice and wet, and then they get to a point where you start to see their actual eyes develop. That's called the eye-up stage, and then they get moved on to the next part, which is the heat incubator. All right, guys, so after the eggs come out of the moist air incubator, and again, once their eyes have developed, they get moved to these things that are called the heat tray stacks. And like you can see, these trays, the heat trays, are just in these stacked columns where they have water flowing down over the top all the time. It's the same idea as the moist air incubator, but instead of like a fine mist spraying on the eggs, there's actual flowing water running over them. So that's what you have to mimic the idea of a stream environment, just that clean, cold, flowing water staying all over the eggs at all times. And these eggs will stay inside the heat tray incubators for another month after coming out of the moist air incubator before being moved to the troughs, which you guys are going to see some video and pictures of here in a second. The adult fish that we have here at the hatchery actually eat this, which is Antarctic krill. It's actually caught in Antarctica, and we get it shipped up here on big pallets. And we go through a lot of it to feed all these brood stuff. So I know you guys can't smell right now, but it smells very fishy, very shrimpy. But it's important that we give the fish this high-quality wild food because that's what helps their immune systems develop. It's what helps them grow healthy and strong. Really feeding these fish what they would eat in the wild has been a big part of what makes our hatchery fish successful and healthy.
My name is Richard the Hillet with the Monterey-based Salmon and Trout Project, and today we are at Kingfisher Flats Fish Hatchery. It's a place where they raise coho salmon. They've been raising coho salmon for a year, and right here is a holding pond where the coho salmon are located. Today is exciting because we get to release these coho salmon into Big Creek so that they can begin their journey down to the Pacific Ocean, and one day return back to Big Creek to spawn.
Watching the final product of the work here at the hatchery, which is the release of this year's smoke flats. So we're releasing thousands of fish today here to Big Creek, and these fish are coming straight from the circular pools you saw earlier out here into the stream, out into Big Creek. The idea is we want them to move down as fast as possible and make it out to the ocean so they can grow and become big salmon and then come back as adults and spawn here in the Scott Creek watershed. This is all part of the work to recover the species. Hey everyone, so we're at a really important place here for the coho broodstock program. This is the Scott Creek Weir, and this is run by NOAA Fisheries, and it's a really important component of the program because it lets us monitor the populations of fish returning to the watershed. So what a weir is basically a fish trap, and you can see here behind me, when the fish is swimming up the stream and it comes to the weir, it has to swim around into a box where it can be sampled by NOAA Fisheries. And what they can do is pit tag it, something called a passive integrated transponder, which is a tag that identifies that fish specifically. And that gives us not only the identity, but the run timing, when that fish came in. You can even tell which direction in the stream the fish is swimming, whether it's going upstream or downstream. So the Weir gives us a lot of really important information for monitoring for the program. And it's really important that we have that so that we can tell how successful the hatchery program is being, and we know how many of our fish are returning to the watershed. The Weir is kind of the heart of the monitoring program for the coho broodstock program at Kingfisher Flat. So a lot of really important science goes on here.
Upstream, we're holding on to the females over 65 centimeters in case Mbari wants to put tags on them.
Okay.
We're monitoring their progress up close. Is the back up and ready?
You guys got 3 last week?
I think so, yeah.
There were 2 yesterday.
Okay.
Wait.
I thought I heard somebody say something about them being tagged. How do they do that?
So it's actually by hand, and as you can imagine, tagging 25, 30,000 fish by hand is kind of labor intensive. So the fish are tagged a number of different ways. We actually coded wire tag, which is a tiny white piece of metal wire that goes in the fish's nose, and every fish in the hatchery gets one of those. All fish that are released as part of our program are tagged with a coded wire tag. They also get another kind called that pit tag that I was talking about next to the Weir there, that is really just a one-to-one identifier, and a proportion of the fish at the hatchery get those. You also saw from some of the slides, the fish have those disc tags. It's like a little number that's almost pinned to their back that lets us identify them just by looking at them without actually having to scan them. So some fish are tagged as many as 3 different ways when they're in captivity at the hatchery at Kingfisher Flat. That's all done by hand. So again, that's a conservation hatchery, and the species you saw there are like the one you see in the picture on the bottom left there, Central California Coast coho. And there's an example of the disc tag I was just talking about. That looks like number 423, and they're color coded. That one's white and blue, so that's a male. I think white and blue was a Warm Springs outbreeder, which means we got that fish from another captivity, another broodstock program, and transferred it here to Kingfisher Flat. So again, all of these fish are marked 3 different ways, and a lot of careful genetic, cutting-edge fishery science goes into this program and how these fish respond in the rear. Now, that's a conservation action that is taken by Monterey Bay Salmon and Trout Project, nonprofit organization. The agencies do a lot of things similar to that with their own conservation hatchery programs or habitat restoration. There is some stuff that you can do at home, things that the average person can do to help salmon and trout. Salmon and steelhead in particular need cold flowing water. That's probably the biggest single item that people could act on to make a positive change, is conserve water. Now that pie chart you see in the bottom left is actually Santa Cruz County. So it's representative here of water use on the Central Coast, and it shows you gallons per person per day, how much a residential home in Santa Cruz County uses as far as water goes. And what caught my attention here is this giant chunk of the pie, this big, 15 of the 60 gallons a day are used for outdoor use. And so, watering your lawn, potted plants, things like that outside. So if we could just maybe transition to some more drought tolerant species, or not have a huge sprawling green lawn, or just get some efficient sprinklers, you would reduce water use substantially just by cutting down on your outdoor water use, or how you water your lawn, your plants outside, things of that nature. The other huge things I noticed about this pie chart are all of these things to the right: the toilet, clothes washer, shower, faucets. Those all have a handle or an on button. That's within your control. you have something that you can do to just minimize how much you're using it every time you use one of those things. So if you're running the clothes to the dishwasher, make sure that it is just jam-packed full. Only do at need basis for any of those things. Pretty much the less often you can run any of those appliances, the less water you can use, and you're conserving water. Other things you can do, that's fill up the clothes washer and dishwasher. Those are great, but you can also just minimize, the time in the shower, how often you do certain tasks that demand water. If you limit to a 5-minute shower, you're going to substantially reduce how much water your house consumes. And if everybody does that, then it's going to take a big chunk of the puzzle out right there. Now, going back to some of the impacts I was talking about earlier, the warming ocean temperatures, that's all going back to global warming and CO2 emissions from humans. And that's, as you can see on the chart, on the pie chart on the right, that's overwhelmingly because of electricity and transportation. So over half of the CO2 emissions from the United States comes from transport, people driving their cars, and electricity, domestic electricity. So ways that you can conserve electricity have a direct contributing factor to reducing CO2 emissions and helping to conserve salmon and steelhead. That kind of heat pollution or thermal pollution that you're talking about is really pervasive around power plants. You actually see different species start to inhabit places around the outflow of power plants because the water is so much warmer. You're going to find fish species hanging out near the outflow of a power plant just because it's got hot water, but the rest of the system around them could be really cold. So it can have an impact for invasive species, but as far as consumption goes, yes, Matt is absolutely right that electricity production uses a massive amount of water, and it's often used to cool down these really hot elements that can, that's generating electricity, it's creating energy. So reducing your CO2 emissions, getting back to the root issue of global climate change, warming ocean temperatures, cutting down on your CO2 emissions can be a really positive thing and a way to be part of the solution. I know that seems like an overwhelming problem, global climate change, but it's the mantra of think globally, act locally is a good one. It's one that you should keep with you. There are things that you can do every day that make an impact on problems that seem pretty insurmountable. And getting back to those useful mantras, the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. And I'm a big advocate of recycling. It's a good thing, but I do think that too much emphasis is put on recycling and not enough on reducing and reusing. If you can reduce how much you originally consume, whether it's single-use plastics or even food, things that you consume less of, that is a better way to do it than to have to go back and recycle it, because recycling takes energy as well. If you don't use something in the first place, that's the best way to reduce your consumption to have a positive impact. Yeah, so reduce, reuse, recycle, think globally, act locally, both very good mantras to carry if you're looking for a positive message from this, something that you can do to help salmon and steelhead.
I'm going to throw in refuse and redesign for the kids.
I like that, Richard. Yeah, so you can refuse and redesign, look at this system that has been developed that is not sustainable and find ways to make it better. I actually appreciate that, Richard. Redesign. Kids need to know that there's rethinking all of this stuff is a welcome change, a needed change. So to that end, there is some stuff that you can do at home. If you're a student taking this as part of the Step to the Sea field trips, you should take this household water assessment that's up on the Google Drive. And it just shows you whether your water consumption is efficient, average, or inefficient. I was kind of mildly shocked because I like to think I'm a very water conscious person. I'm kind of right on the borderline of between efficient and average. I thought I was going to come clocking in way under the efficient use, and that's just not true. So I'm gonna go back and kind of reassess my water use and try to get closer to where I thought I was before I took this assessment. So maybe you can do the same thing. 120 gallons per person per day, it's really inefficient. There is a PDF on there as well that shows you some of the things that you can do to reduce your water consumption. Stuff I was talking about earlier, it's taking shorter showers, less than 5 minutes, using plants or landscaping that requires less water, shut off nodules, Energy Star appliances, aerators on faucets, using a broom, not a hose to clean driveways, walkways. All of these things are kind of low-hanging fruit as far as making a positive impact on water consumption. So everybody should be aware of the things there on the right and do them if possible. Getting back to what you can do at home, there's not just consumption or the water use, what's inside the 4 walls of your house, but there's always stuff going on in the habitats around you. Like I said, salmon habitats are constantly a threat from development. So if you see somewhere that you know is a salmon habitat and someone is taking an action that might hurt it, speak up. Speak up to protect your local salmon habitats and make sure people know just how important rivers, watersheds, streams are to the entire ecosystem, not just salmon and steelhead. You can support local conservation efforts. This is not a plug for MBSTP, but we are a nonprofit organization, so you can find one of those local to you and support it by either donating or volunteering. And I think you'll find that in the United States, at least, a lot of the heavy lifting for conservation is done by private nonprofit organizations. So try to identify those and find a way to support them through donations and volunteerism.
Ben, what are some volunteer opportunities? I know that when things are rolling, that they have the fish clipping at the hatchery.
Yeah, so some of the things that we have going on right now, we're likely going to have steelhead rescues going on this summer. It's a way for people to go help out local watersheds, that streams that dry up, move fish, help MBSTP move fish to higher up or lower down in the watershed where the water stays year round. And those are a volunteer supported effort. We also have weekend volunteers at the hatchery who do things like maintain the tanks, feed the fish. And that's, again, really important for keeping us able to operate Kingfisher Flat. It's only doable because we have the support of volunteers and membership. So those are two really big volunteer things. And you could be a part of the STEP program. You could volunteer to support this effort, which is trying to educate kids in local schools. And we're always looking for volunteers to support the outreach to local schools and school districts.
I think I started as a volunteer at the hatchery, and it was really fun. And I also want to just throw in a plug for the rescues. During summer, it's really hot, getting out there, being able to get in the creek. And the riparian corridor, you cool down. And also you're just like rescuing fish at the same time. So, it's very rewarding and also rewarding for yourself at the same time.
No, thanks, Richard. It's super rewarding. And let that be a cautionary tale that you could become a real fish nerd like Richard, too. If you just get started volunteering, you can get sucked in and never get back out. But it's a good thing. It's a great thing to be a part of. You do feel good with all of the stuff that at least MBSTP does things I'm always proud to be a part of. So as far as what you can do at home, volunteerism is a great thing. Kind of bridging into the last aspect of this lesson today is people who want to take it a step further and get a career in conservation, become a fisheries or wildlife scientist or a conservation biologist. The best thing to do at least in my experience, the best thing to do to get into a state or federal resource agency as a biologist is to start small, things like internships and seasonal positions. Don't swing for the fences thinking you're going to go in there as like a managing biologist with a state or federal agency, because the reality is most of the people in those positions put in their time as seasonal interns or even volunteers before they made it up that high. There really is a lot of opportunity every year. They do hire seasonal positions. Working in water is generally done in the summertime, but some of this field work is done in the winter as well. So my advice would be to find internships and seasonal positions, if at all possible, to kind of get your stepping stone into the field. Once you're in there, the best way to find jobs as a professional fisheries, wildlife, conservation biologist is to look at things like usajobs.gov, the state job boards. They're usually called governmentjobs.org. In California's is a little different. It's got something called Cal Careers. But really just governmentjobs.org is for most of the states in this country, and usajobs.gov is for the federal government, and they're required to post all federal positions open to the public on USA Jobs. So that's the best place to find those if you're actually looking for job opportunities after, having a seasonal position or an internship. Then once you're established in one of those positions, it's really important that you join a chapter of the professional organization, whether it's the American Fisheries Society, the Wildlife Society. These are ways for professional biologists to not only to communicate with one another, but also to grow their careers. So if you're a member of one of those organizations, you kind of got the in to what is happening in your field, where things are going as far as opportunities and the profession in general. So I think those are pretty the three major steps you could take. Start small, start with an internship or a seasonal position, find a job by looking at the available resources, and then cultivate your career by staying a member of one of the professional organizations. And since I am the director of a nonprofit, I am going to plug again that volunteerism is how a lot of this work gets done. So volunteer if at all possible. on all of these job applications on the federal and state job boards. They ask for experience. It does not have to be paid experience. When you're looking at volunteer experience, it is valuable. It is as valuable as the paid professional experience. So volunteer with your local chapter of a conservation nonprofit, and that can really go a long way. So any questions they want to talk about? Any comments? Anything at all?
Thank you so much, actually. I'm kind of blown away. It's so beautifully presented and it's so important. And I believe a lot in climate, I'm not for climate change and I fight against it and I do all the things I can. But you've shown me more today that I wasn't aware of. And it's really exciting to see you saving these species and our planet too. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for your kind words. It takes people like you to make positive change and positive action, people that are invested in it and care about it. That's really the first step. If we can't do that, then none of this stuff really goes anywhere. And that's part of the beautiful thing about the STEP program with MBSTP is that it's all about engaging with youth and trying to get the next generation to care about watersheds and the environment. So yeah, I'm happy to be a part of it. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it. I think that conservation is it's not a question for you or me, it's a question for everyone and not just this generation, but future as well.
Yeah.
Matt had a question as well.
I would just a comment. There are a lot of species out there that are in trouble right now, and we have concern for all of them, and don't want to lose any. But salmon in particular occupy a keystone niche. They're a keystone species, particularly where they're more abundant. Here in Santa Cruz, they historically were way more abundant. And what the keystone means is that they not only are affected their own population, but they radically affect their existence, strengthens and enhances all of the ecosystems in which they exist. So for a salmon, that means a high mountain stream, the main river, the estuary, the ocean, and not just the local ocean, but all the way up the coast, maybe to Alaska and back again and back upstream. So they have a really important connective life cycle that is unique, and awareness of how these animals are doing is an indicator to humans as to how we are doing in conserving and in changing our behavior to enhance all ecosystems.
Oh, well said, Matt. You would be hard pressed to find a species that ties together far apart places better than salmon. If you were looking at birds, you might say something like Canada geese. There's a lot of terrestrial species that have huge ranges, but 1,600, 1,700 miles migrated by a Chinook salmon upriver is pretty unmatched in the natural world as far as I know, at least with anadromous migration. So yeah, they tie together all these habitats and are a key component of all of them, not just the streams and rivers, but the ocean as well. Being an indicator species is something that we should be paying a lot more attention to say that.
Where can I find this information about all these things you're talking about? You have a website.
We do have a website. It's mbstp.org. Just our abbreviation.org. And it tells you about each one of our programs. We kind of have 4 major conservation programs that are all directed towards salmon and steelhead. But we are, as far as the information about global climate change and the threats, some of that information is on our website. A lot of it is just in this PowerPoint. I've pulled it together so I can share anything or answer anything. But what MBSTP does is all on our website for sure.
I just want to mention that this is just one of a series of 6 that will be available on the Monterey Bay Salmon Trout Project website, as well as on Virtual Photo Walk's YouTube. In addition, it's refreshing and encouraging to know that these videos will be made available to school children, elementary school children, and beyond, so that they can learn about this and hopefully take action. So yes.
So we've got a great series of videos here that I know John and Richard have put a ton of work into. So you can always check them out on the MBSTP website or YouTube. And there's a lot of great information packed in there if you want to learn about. We've talked a lot about the importance of estuaries today. Richard's got a whole lesson on estuaries. And he's got a whole lesson on benthic macroinvertebrates and the importance of the riparian corridor. So if you want to dive into this in more depth, a good place to start, I should have started with this. A good place to start would be just lesson 1, small fry, on the MBSTP webpage, and then just watch through them. Thank you, everyone who's been a regular participant in the Step to the Sea Field series. I really appreciate you showing up. It's been great having you, and I hope you've enjoyed your walk through the world of salmon and kind of the efforts that are being taken by MBSTP and others to keep them around and conserve them. Thank you, John and Richard, Matt, and Meg, everybody that's been a part of this. It's been special.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
Bye all.
Bye, everybody.
You guys.
Bye. Thank you.